his body was not in good shape, and being that it was outdoors, we needed dental records to confirm his identity.
It all began with Keith discovering that Tiffany had an affair with his friend Kavi.
In the beginning, when we first broke off, he asked each kid $20 million. He asked my mom for each kid. And my mom said, "You're ridiculous."
What happens when you take a self-absorbed heiress, a desperate ex-boyfriend, and a manipulative lover, and you weave them into a web of deceit? Someone often turns up dead. I'm Dr. Tophat Shadow, and this is The Shadow Self. It was a spring morning in one of the wealthiest parts of Northern California, in a beautiful upscale region of the Bay Area known as the Peninsula, a quiet mountain-lined town called Millbrae. Located about 30 minutes outside of San Francisco, birds were singing, flowers were blooming, and people were honking politely. The year was 2016. The world had not yet gone through its drastic COVID-driven transition. And yet, there were some things that remained the same. Things such as treachery, greed, and murder. Keith Green and his ex, Tiffany Li, had been separated for about 6 months. Keith worked as an aspiring chef, while Tiffany was the heiress to a Chinese real estate and construction empire, valued at more than $100 million. The two had met in high school, when Tiffany was 17 and Keith was 14. But they began officially dating around the year 2003. Keith eventually moved into Tiffany's sprawling $8 million mansion in the town of Hillsborough, just a short drive from Millbrae. 12 years flew by, and along the way, they became parents to 2 beautiful daughters whom they were both very fond of. We've blurred the children's faces to maintain their privacy. From the outside, it seemed they had everything going for them. A young couple with an abundance of time, 2 healthy children, a mansion surrounded by luxury cars, and a pile of disposable income. However, this would not be enough to make the couple whole. Plenty of issues had arisen over the years, and with plenty of red flags waving in the wind, resentment began seeping in through the cracks of their relationship, and, as often precludes an act of violence, sinister thoughts had started brewing. Corvée Boyett was an area local and a friend of Keith Green. According to Tiffany, Corvée was Keith's marijuana supplier, and the two had known one another for some time. Naturally, Keith introduced Tiffany to Corvée. The two initially had a casual acquaintanceship, but that didn't last long. Their acquaintanceship spawned a curious interest in Tiffany, and it soon developed into a more robust kind of friendship, one that required far more than just the occasional nod and a smile. Keith had a hunch that there was something going on between his friend and the mother of his children, and unfortunately, his suspicions were proven correct. He came home one day to find that Tiffany had been having an affair with Corvée. This would drive a bitter wedge between the three, and Keith and Tiffany would embark on an acrimonious breakup. Tiffany swiftly kicked Keith out of her mansion, and with a sudden drop in room temperature, she moved Corvée in to replace him. Now, with Keith and Tiffany separated, yet having 2 children together, Tiffany was having to consider the dynamic between Keith, their children, and of course, her family fortune. Tiffany had her lawyers draft a mutual separation agreement, encouraging Keith to sign it. But after reading through it, Keith declined to sign. He allegedly wanted $4,000 a month, a $20,000 lump sum, and one of her vehicles. An amount, he said, that would enable him and his daughters to continue living a lifestyle equivalent to hers. But this request only angered Tiffany. No resolution was reached. Neither her mutual agreement nor his counter to the agreement did anything to help resolve their problems. And to make matters more strenuous, Corvée was inserting himself into the mix, doing his part to drive the wedge deeper between the young family. With Corvée living at the mansion, he always had Tiffany's ear nearby. Now both he and Tiffany had heaps of private time to spoon-feed each other, an endless loop of negative sentiments about Keith. Corvée began spending time with Keith's daughters as well, even referring to one of them as his own.
She hitting that donut, right? Her first donut, y'all. My daughter doing her donuts.
This angered Keith, and he made threats to his former friend, as he felt this was not only disrespectful to say, but to post it on social media for their circle of friends to see. Keith continued asking Tiffany for an amount which he thought to be adequate, and Tiffany continued rejecting his request, growing more angry by the day with Keith. Keith grew more frustrated by the day with Tiffany, and all the while, Tiffany shared her feelings on the matter with her new boyfriend, Carvey. Meanwhile, Carvey had taken a trip to Las Vegas. While there, he had gotten a tattoo on his torso of Tiffany's face and a panda bear holding 2 guns. A strange yet very interesting way to try and ink himself permanently into the situation. Things were not going well for Keith. He had lost his home, his girlfriend, and his friend in one foul swoop. He didn't want to lose his children as well. Under pressure, he was looking for a new place to stay and a way to get back on his feet. He and Tiffany were reluctantly sharing custody of the children, but one major difference between them was that money and shelter were actually an issue for Keith. Tiffany owned several luxury cars, including a Bentley, a Ferrari, a G-Wagon, a BMW, a Mercedes-AMG, and a Range Rover. She filed a police report against Keith, in which she accused him of stealing her Range Rover. Keith, unaware of Tiffany's accusation, made plans to meet up with her at a local Starbucks in order to discuss issues surrounding custody of the children. But instead, the police were there waiting for him to arrive. He was placed under arrest and booked into the county jail. He contacted an attorney, who later discovered text messages from Tiffany, in which she admitted that she had falsely filed the report and that Keith had not actually stolen the vehicle from her. Meanwhile, Tiffany had secretly hired a private investigator to spy on Keith, even on days when he didn't have custody of the girls. The investigator not only spied on Keith, but followed a woman whom Keith had begun seeing. On top of this, Tiffany began recording their phone conversations.
It sucks. I don't want to leave the kids, but I don't know what to do. Like, I've been so stressed trying to figure this out, and it's been really, really bad.
I'm saying to you, we both made mistakes, and that's that. Let's just move on. There's nothing I can say right now.
It's very easy for you to sit here and say whatever you want to say because your life has not changed at all. The only thing that's different is that you have a new man that you sleep next to at night. That's it.
I'm very happy. Aren't you happy that I'm happy? I thought if you care about me, you would think that I'm happy.
In front of you, I'm asking him, okay?
Yeah.
Did you say that you're gonna have Cab killed? Talk to Issa? Okay. But why? Okay, but why?
It seemed that some kind of narrative was being written. The creation of a story, perhaps from a particular point of view. But speculation aside, a web was being woven. And what a tangled web it was becoming. 6 months passed, and Keith had managed to settle into an apartment in Millbrae, where he was staying with a family friend. Money and child custody was still a contentious topic between him and Tiffany, and so they had made plans to meet up once again. At around 10:15 p.m., Keith's friend recalls him saying he was going to meet up with Tiffany. The plan was to meet at the Millbrae Pancake House, which was across the street from Keith's apartment. Thus, Keith would not need a car to get there. He could simply walk. He casually got up, leaving his wallet and keys on the coffee table. He said he'd be back shortly, and he strolled across the street. Keith made his way to Tiffany's Mercedes G-Wagon. He climbed inside the vehicle, and the two began talking. According to Tiffany, Keith confessed to her that he still loved her and wanted to get back together in order to be a whole family again. He even discussed the possibility of moving to another state and starting over. Plus, he was having a difficult time making ends meet as a chef in the upscale Peninsula. The discussion ended after about 1 hour, but that's when the story gets murky. Keith had only a 2-minute walk back to his apartment. He was quite literally only 30 paces away. However, even with no wallet, keys, or car, he would not return home that night. No one had heard from Keith since his meetup with Tiffany at the Pancake House. He wasn't picking up calls or responding to texts, and friends and family were concerned over his sudden lack of communication. They knew that things between the couple had not been amicable. They were also aware of the complexities within their triangle. Their concerns grew deeper when, about 20 miles away, a hiker in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park happened to notice a cell phone laying by a patch of dirt along a hiking trail. The hiker turned the phone in, and it was discovered that its owner was Keith Green. With Tiffany being the last known person to see Keith, 2 detectives drove out to her Hillsborough mansion in order to ask her if she knew of Keith's whereabouts. When they arrived, they found Tiffany and Carvey there. But they weren't alone. They were having dinner with another couple, a woman who we shall call Yuma, and Yuma's husband, Olivier Adela. Olivier was somewhat of a mysterious individual. Born in the Ivory Coast, he claimed to have served in the French Foreign Legion as a soldier and fought in the Civil War, a war that claimed the lives of many and displaced many more. Olivier had managed to escape the carnage, fleeing from the Ivory Coast, making it to France, and eventually making his way to the United States after securing a counterfeit passport. At 6'5", he took up bodybuilding, mixed martial arts, and kickboxing. His professional title was limousine driver, and fittingly, he worked as a bodyguard for Tiffany and Carvey. He also happened to live in an apartment complex which was owned by the Li family and managed by Tiffany. Although they did not come away with much, detectives quietly noted who was there at the mansion that night. These would be people of interest, and if Keith did not eventually turn up, they would likely end up coming back around to speak in more detail with these individuals. 3 days had gone by without a word from Keith. A missing persons report had been filed, and investigators began making their rounds and gathering pertinent information in the search for Keith Green. They had got in possession of Keith's cell phone and had begun to interview his circle of family and friends. Although it had been only 4 days since his disappearance, there were red flags that investigators had noticed. Aside from Keith's sudden drop-off in communication, they were alarmed by the fact that he'd left his wallet and car at home, as well as the fact that he'd made no attempt to retrieve his missing phone. Meanwhile, friends began posting missing flyers around the Millbrae area. They gave interviews with local news stations, asking the public for help. Detectives even brought reporters to the hiking trail where Keith's phone had been found. Although they had not yet called foul play, the situation was beginning to look ominous. After having put up hundreds of missing person posters around town, spreading the word on Facebook, and speaking with numerous investigators, Keith's loved ones were forced to come face to face with the worst-case scenario. Keith's body had been found. It was discovered in a secluded grassy area of Healdsburg, about 2 hours north of Millbrae. It had been there for over a week, stripped naked and badly decomposed. The coroner determined that before being dumped in the field, a gun had been placed in Keith's mouth, and the trigger pulled, sending a bullet through the back of Keith's neck. Now the case would be moved from missing persons to homicide. Although the case had already caught the media's attention, homicide investigators decided to keep their findings from the public as they sifted through evidence. As they had noted when they visited the mansion 2 weeks earlier, investigators had a short list of people who they suspected they would end up coming back around for: Tiffany Li, Cave Bayet, and Olivier Adela. Before the crack of dawn, on the morning of Saturday, May 21, 2016, a SWAT team converged on Tiffany's estate. They broke through the tall steel gates and banged on the mansion's double doors. After finding Tiffany and Cave there, they placed them under arrest. They booked them into the San Mateo County Jail and informed them that they had already taken Olivier into custody the day before. 3 days later, on May 24th, all 3 suspects were charged in the murder of Keith Green. They appeared in court, shackled and in orange jumpsuits, where the judge addressed them for the first time in order to read the charges against them. They were facing a first-degree murder charge, with an enhancement due to the use of a firearm to commit the murder. A charge that carries a sentence of 25 years to life, with 25 being the minimum. Tiffany's mother and brother had come into town to show their support for her, as well as to get the wheels in motion with her legal defense team. Interestingly, shortly after her lawyer was hired, Tiffany wrote a letter to Keith. It appeared she viewed herself as a victim in the situation, with no sympathy towards Keith and no acknowledgement of what had happened to him. "I was really sad when I got in here. Because why me? But I chose to date Cave and bring bad people around me. I'm always so effing stupid, like you always would tell me before. Everyone thinks I have something to do with this, but only you know the truth." Was there a bit of coaching going on from the defense? One can only wonder. Meanwhile, Tiffany's mother was staying at the Hillsborough mansion, watching over Tiffany and Keith's daughters. But Keith's mother expressed that she feared for the safety of the children, noting that Tiffany's mother, who resides in Beijing for most of the year, posed a flight risk, and that she could potentially take them away. Tiffany's lawyer pushed back, stating that these were false allegations, as Tiffany's mother was an American citizen. But Keith's mother's concern resonated with the court, and 2 days later, the girls were taken from the Hillsborough mansion and placed under protective custody. Tiffany's mother then went to the Redwood City Courthouse to file a motion to reverse the protection order. But that motion to reverse was denied by the presiding judge. Tiffany's lawyer then accused the government of kidnapping, stating that the children were taken unlawfully. Meanwhile, the two innocent children, ages 2 and 4, were caught in the crossfire of this tragic situation. The web that had been woven was growing more tangled by the day. Things moved slow. Days, weeks, and months ticked away, as they typically do while high-profile trials are gearing up to start. This gave Tiffany's high-priced team of lawyers time to prepare for a strong defense. This was also the time at which she and her co-defendants finally had their bail hearings. The judge would hear the defense out and decide whether or not bail should be granted, and if so, tell them exactly how much money it would cost. With an execution-style murder charge, and the body being disposed of in the manner that it was, one would expect bail to be denied. Plus, the district attorney had asked for no bail, stating that Tiffany, facing life in prison, was a high-flight risk. But Tiffany's team was confident that she would be granted bail. And they were right. Albeit, they expected the bail amount to be very high. But how high? They had no idea. The judge set bail at $35 million. The 8th highest amount in U.S. court history. For most people, this would be an impossible amount to come up with, but from a financial standpoint, Tiffany's family was not most people. Rather than posting all cash, they posted $4 million in cash, and the rest in property. This required them to put up enough property as collateral to account for almost twice the bail amount. With the $4 million cash included, this meant that they would need to put up over $60 million in property. A problem for them, this was not. Tiffany's $65 million bail was posted, and 2 days later, on April 6th, she walked free, with the promise that she would wear an ankle monitor and would not flee the country. Carvey and Olivier remained behind bars, without bail. Considering the heinous crime and the serious charges against Tiffany, Keith's supporters voiced their frustrations, asking if Tiffany's family was not a real estate dynasty, would she still be granted bail?
When you have many, hundreds of millions of dollars, you wonder if that plays into it.
One can only wonder. The prosecutor had spent months gathering evidence against Tiffany. Now, they had what they believed would be enough to convict her of the murder of Keith Green. They also had evidence which led them to determine that Carvey and Olivier were directly involved. And with each of the accused having separate legal representation, things were bound to get hairy, and fingers were bound to start pointing. Time would soon tell. According to Tiffany's defense team, it was in fact Olivier who pulled off the entire crime. They claimed that he had been stalking Tiffany and Keith while they had their meeting in the Millbrae Pancake House parking lot, and that after Keith exited the vehicle, Olivier attempted to kidnap him. That's when they claimed things went south, and Olivier decided to murder Keith and dump his body in Healdsburg. Olivier refuted this, claiming that Tiffany and Carvey were trying to pin a murder on him, which they themselves were responsible for. He expressed a desire to speak with prosecutors, and in February of 2018, he cut a deal with them in which they would drop the murder charge against him in exchange for his truthful testimony against both Tiffany and Carvey. According to Olivier, on the night Keith went missing, he had been asked by Carvey to keep a distant watch over Tiffany during her conversation with Keith in the Millbrae Pancake House parking lot. He claimed that he waited in his car, watching, as the two talked in Tiffany's Mercedes G-Wagon. After he saw Tiffany drive away, he followed her for a short distance, then turned to go home, calling Carvey on the way to tell him that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. He claimed, later that evening, Tiffany showed up at his apartment complex, with Carvey riding in the back seat, and Keith's body in the front passenger seat. He said Carvey then flashed a gun, and said, "I did what I needed to do, now it's time to pull your weight." Together, under the orders of Carvey, they stripped Keith's body, and put him in the trunk of Olivier's car. Carvey then told Olivier to get rid of the phone and the body, with the promise of a large cash payment. Olivier then drove the car north to Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, where he disposed of Keith's phone on a hiking trail. He continued driving north for another hour and a half, where he found a secluded field in Healdsburg and dumped Keith's body. He claims that he knew if he did not comply with the couple, they would try and pin the murder on him, and that either way, he was screwed. The district attorney's office was confident that they had a strong case against Tiffany and Carvey. They claimed that after the Millbrae Pancake House parking lot meeting, Tiffany lured Keith back to her mansion and pulled into the garage, where Carvey was waiting. Carvey then allegedly ordered Keith out of the vehicle, where he forced a gun into his mouth, and then pulled the trigger. Tiffany and Carvey of course denied this, but evidence gathered by detectives, along with Olivier's testimony, illustrated how and why prosecutors developed these allegations. They first referred to the police body cam footage when officers visited the mansion and broke the news to Tiffany that they'd found Keith's body.
We have some difficult news. We've found Keith's body. Or not necessarily, we didn't find it, but another agency found Keith's body.
Okay.
And so I wanted to let you know that, kind of as a courtesy.
They noted the fact that she had just been told the father of her children was found dead in a field, and yet she seemed to show no emotion. They also highlighted some key moments in her interview with investigators. One was when Tiffany made the shocking claim that Keith had demanded $20 million for each of their children. A long stretch from $4,000 a month, plus the $20,000 lump sum that she had previously said he asked for.
In the beginning, when we first broke off, he asked each kid $20 million. He asked my mom for each kid. And my mom said, "You're ridiculous."
Investigators had scratched their heads on this statement. But, whether or not it was true, it was clear that Tiffany saw her money as a contentious issue between her and Keith. When asked about the night Keith disappeared, Tiffany had claimed that Keith left her vehicle after their discussion in the parking lot of the Millbrae Pancake House. But cell signals from Keith's phone revealed that Keith, or at least his phone, had remained in her vehicle and returned back to the mansion with her. Tiffany, however, had said that she had driven to 1800 Truesdale, the same apartment complex where Olivier lived, but that she was simply there to pick up a rent check from one of their tenants, since her family owned several apartments in the complex. When detectives asked her what she did next, she replied with, "I think I drove home." They then asked, "How is it that you don't have a better memory of this night? April 28, 2016, is the night that the father of your children disappeared, correct? Are you aware of the fact that April 28, 2016, is the night that Keith Green disappeared?" Her response to this was no. They then showed her images of her G-Wagon traveling south. Traffic cameras also showed that Olivier did indeed follow behind her for a short time before turning and heading off in another direction towards his home. This would corroborate with Olivier's testimony. Prosecutors then noted that a short while after Tiffany and Keith's cell signals are seen going to her mansion, the signals show them heading back out and traveling north. But this time, with Carvey's cell signal also in the car with them. Once again, this corroborated with Olivier's account of that night. An interesting subtlety was that when asked if she would ever harm Keith, Tiffany says no, but unconsciously nods her head yes.
Would you harm Keith? No, I will not harm Keith. Would you harm Keith? No, I will not harm Keith.
In the exhibits presented to the jury, prosecutors showed that investigators had found gunshot residue on a golf bag in the garage, and Keith's DNA on the floor next to the golf bag. They also found his DNA on the door sill of the G-Wagon. Next, prosecutors showed a text message that was sent from Keith to Tiffany, in which he had asked for the $4,000 monthly stipend, the $20,000 lump payment, and one of her cars. He went on to say, "I do want to create a life that is parallel with yours, for the kids." Phone records show that shortly before their meetup at the Pancake House, Tiffany forwarded that message to Carvey, who responded with, "He was trying to work you for money again. That's all he wants. It's not about the kids." Tiffany responds with, "I know. Okay, so never mind. Green light." Prosecutors alleged that the term, green light, was a signal to kill Keith. But Tiffany's defense claimed she was simply referring to giving in to some of Keith's demands. Olivier's wife Yuma took the stand, testifying that after Keith's disappearance, Tiffany asked her if she knew anything about traffic surveillance cameras. Yuma said that Tiffany then admitted she'd lied to police when she told them that she drove alone after meeting Keith at a pancake house in Millbrae, and that Keith was indeed a passenger in the front seat. Yuma also testified that after Keith disappeared, she overheard Carvey mention that he had put a gun to Keith's head. But defense attorneys for Carvey gave an explanation for this, claiming that Carvey was not talking about what he actually did. He was only referring to false accusations that he had read on social media. They also noted to the court that Yuma's husband, Olivier, was also a suspect in Keith's murder, which might give a good reason to lie in court. Although there was no murder weapon and much of the evidence was circumstantial or witness dependent, it appeared that the DA had a strong case. However, things would take a drastic change, causing both the prosecution and the defense to have to go back to the drawing board. Part of Olivier's agreement with prosecutors had been that during the trial, he was not allowed to use social media, nor was he allowed to contact any other witnesses. However, he broke this agreement when he made contact through Instagram with one of the defense's witnesses whom he knew. This was a tremendous blunder. And in a shocking turn of events, the prosecution team informed the judge of this and were forced to ask that Olivier be removed as a witness and remanded back to jail. This was a huge blow to them and a big win for Tiffany and Carvey, as it took the key witness out of the picture, preventing Olivier from testifying against them. Several more witnesses were called for the prosecution, including the woman Keith had been seeing before he was murdered. But with the Olivier blunder and no hard evidence directly connecting Keith's murder to Tiffany or Carvey, things were looking grim for the DA. Their hefty argument had suddenly lost weight. The jury deliberated for more than 3 weeks, and on November 15, 2019, the jury announced it had reached its verdicts.
Despite a mountain of evidence presented by prosecutors, a jury here in Redwood City found Tiffany Li not guilty of murdering her ex-boyfriend, Keith Green.
Tiffany's defense team had been able to cast enough doubt on the prosecution's case by claiming that it was Olivier who killed Keith in a botched kidnapping attempt. And without proving that Tiffany was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, the prosecution was not able to clinch a guilty verdict in the murder of Keith Green. Tiffany Li was acquitted on all counts. Carvey Bayet was found not guilty on a gun charge. The jury was deadlocked on all other charges against him, unable to agree on a verdict and forcing a hung jury. Thus, the judge declared a mistrial.
Can you tell us what you're feeling right now? Ridicule.
Happy.
Following this, the DA announced that he would not pursue a retrial of Carvey Bayet. Because Olivier had admitted to helping dispose of Keith Green's body, he served the remainder of his 3-year sentence for accessory after the fact. He is now free. In 2021, a civil suit was filed against Tiffany Li by Keith's mother. Tiffany agreed to pay $100,000 to Keith's mother, $50,000 to Keith's estate, and a much larger amount to the children, who Tiffany has full custody of. They have since moved out of the United States and now live in China. Olivier, Yuma, and their children have moved out of the peninsula after facing death threats and other forms of harassment. Carvey's whereabouts are unknown. He and Tiffany have not spoken since they were first arrested in May of 2016. No one has ever been brought to justice for the murder of Keith Green.
Unfortunately, the jury did not get to see my son in the light of the person that he actually was.
Is it confusing that they can have one person who's not guilty and the other person that is guilty?
It is confusing because she orchestrated all of this. I knew her for 6 years. She was evil. She was evil to me. She was evil to my son. She was just evil. And she is.
Do you think you'll ever get justice?
Karma will take care of that for her.
From the moment we are born, our personal legacy begins to take shape. And as we forge our path through life, the decisions we make etch permanent markings in that legacy. Some of those markings we display proudly, while others we go out of our way to conceal, perhaps feeling as though they will go undetected by consequence. And so, we stow them away, never to be revealed to anyone outside of ourselves. However, those decisions remain a fixture within our conscious, wallowing in the pool of our memories like a creature sleeping at the bottom of a lake. Until one day, consequence decides to rouse that creature from its slumber and abruptly draw it back to the surface. What are your thoughts on the case? Did one of them get away with murder? Perhaps they all did. Leave your comments below. And if you found enjoyment in this video, click the digital button labeled subscribe. I've been your host, Dr. Tophat Shadow. And this is The Shadow Self.